Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think it's a cliche at the start of an event like this to say you're happy to be here, but I can tell you I'm really happy to be here. Thank you. Whenever people said you should go to Berkshire because who knows how many more opportunities there were going to be, I always thought they were referring to Charlie Munger. But I've received so many well wishes from you, lots of emails from people who aren't here as well. I haven't had a chance to respond to those yet, but I will do next week. Thank you so much. It means a lot to me. And yeah, I couldn't be happier to be here. Sitting next to me is David Kerr. I'm going to introduce you David shortly. But first of all, I'm going to introduce some of the other important people here and then quickly go through the agenda for the next 2 days. And then we'll get to our fireside chat. So I have a partner since the last time we met, a business partner, Andreas. Are you here? Andreas will join me on the Q&A in the second section, so I'll wait until then before introducing you. I also have a board member of my company now responsible for compliance, Reinhard Zimmermann. On the DJ, on the technical equipment, as always, is Tillman. Thank you, Tillman, for all of your efforts. And then many of you asked whether my children will be handing out the mics for the chat later on. They will be. I don't see them yet here. It looks like they're still sleeping in, so we'll maybe hold back the applause for when they come a bit later. So what is the agenda? A lot of you will be familiar with it. A few changes, a few tweaks compared to prior years, but not too many. Shortly, in a few moments, I'm going to do a fireside chat with David. That will be from 9 until 10. And then from 10 until 10:30, there'll be a coffee break. From 10:30 until 12 o'clock, there's going to be the Q&A with Andreas and me. You can ask whatever you want. Last year was obviously a tough year, not just from a health perspective, but also from an investment management perspective. There's not much we can do about last year's performance, but we can answer your questions and talk about whatever's on your mind. So we're very much looking forward to that. Then at 12 o'clock, the formal sessions break, but the conversations will continue. And there's sort of two streams that we can go on. So there's the skiers in the group. Roughly, I think typically sort of about a third of the group are skiers. And there, traditionally, we have our resident powder hound in Nate Chesley. Nate, do you want to quickly stand up? He's very kindly organizes the skiing every year. Yeah, quick round of applause, maybe. And so the skiers need to orientate themselves towards him. And in the past years, Joel Cohen, Nate's colleague, has organized the hikers. Joel couldn't be here this year, but Andreas is going to take care of the hikers. So if you're thinking more of going for a walk around the Trübsee, which is a very nice lake, sort of halfway up the mountain, then orientate yourselves towards Andreas after the morning sessions. Then we'll meet back here at 6 p.m. All the stools will be cleared away, and there'll be buffet-style, or rather cocktail-style tables put up, and a buffet, the idea being that people can move around, talk to each other. It's an incredibly friendly, open group, as I'm sure many of you have already noticed from last night. Everyone is always delighted to connect with other people. I don't advertise this event. Anyone who comes, it's because they've actively sort of selected in to come, and that I think always creates a really sort of positive dynamic of it's really only people here who want to be here. And I'm sure, especially if you're new to the event, you'll have lots of really interesting connections this evening. Then on Sunday, we meet back here at 9 a.m., and there's going to be 3 sessions. First, I'm going to do a fireside chat with one of my peers. Up until Andreas joined, I was working on my own, but I didn't, in a formal perspective, but I wasn't working on my own in the sense that I was working in isolation. I've always had a very vibrant community of investors that I exchange ideas with, and every year I normally do a fireside chat with one of those. And this year, I'm happy to say, it will be with Matthias Riechert. Matthias, do you want to quickly stand up? And then that will be from 9 until 9:45. There'll be no pause. Then we're going to go from 9:45 to 10:30. A new type event. We have an author present amongst the group. Jacob McDonnell, are you around? There he is. I only met Jacob this year at the Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting, at a book signing where he actually very kindly recognized me, which was nice, as he's the one who put the effort in writing a book. I really loved the book, and when he said he was going to come to this meeting, I asked if we could do a fireside chat, and yeah, really looking forward to that tomorrow. He's brought some copies of his book with him, and he's going to do a signing afterwards if anyone wants to get one of his books. So there'll be a pause between 10:30 and 11 a.m. Tomorrow for the signing. And then it will be the final session. It always flies by quicker than you would hope. And traditionally, we've always done a panel discussion as a final session. There will be a panel discussion again this year. The tweak is, in the past, it was always investors in funds. You know, the purpose of tomorrow's sessions is really to help emerging managers to get started. And like I say, in the past, the conversations were with people who invest in funds. And the tweak tomorrow will be, we're going to have 3 emerging managers up on the stage. Recently started managers. So people who started a fund in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, as they have the more immediate experience of, you know, what it takes to get started, what the challenges are, how they solve them. So I'm looking forward to that. It'll be a slightly different perspective to prior years. So that's the schedule. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce David for the fireside chat. A few of you might be wondering where the fireside is, actually. But as you may have noticed, in Europe, we have a little bit of a shortage of energy at the moment. So we went for the environmentally friendly solution. But I hope we could still recreate the same sense of coziness. David, thank you so much for coming. You're from New Zealand, which means you and your lovely wife, Debbie, had a 30-hour flight over yesterday to get here. I think that almost certainly makes you having had the longest journey.
We did indeed, Rob, and it's great to be here. And I just need to note that Debbie and I had our 50th wedding anniversary on the flight.
Wow.
She's shown great loyalty, I suggest.
That sets a very high bar for all of us. You know, we've known each other for many years. You're the very long-term, or you were until very recently, the long-term chairman of Ryman Healthcare. You recently stepped down as both chairman and as a board member. I'm delighted to have you here because I think you could speak to the history of the company longer than pretty much anyone alive today. I know you wanted to emphasize, though, you're speaking as an investor in the company today, as opposed to an official spokesman for the company.
Exactly. So I don't have any information that you don't already have as a result of the half-year result, and I suppose I could advise that I feel the similar pain to other shareholders just right now. So yes, and look, it's really nice to be here, and companies like Ryman are blessed with long-term investors such as Rob's Capital Investment and many of you around the room. So look, it was really nice to meet with you last evening, a number of you, and I look forward to chatting with you again over the next day or so.
Great. So I know a lot of the people here will be very familiar with Ryman, others less so. We're going to talk about Ryman in a few moments, but I think first of all we would love to get to know you. And you're actually a GP, a doctor. So my first question is, how does a medical practitioner end up as chairman of one of New Zealand's largest companies?
Well, yes. So you're right. I trained in medicine in New Zealand. I'm going to speak a little slowly so that everybody can understand me. And I entered general practice, family medicine, and with a mortgage and all those sorts of responsibilities. And when Debbie and I were doing up houses, we would go to a paving company to buy paving stones, and to a plant company to buy plants. And the paving stone company was owned by a man called John Ryder, who I then developed a bit of a relationship with, and he became a patient. And he also owned Athol McCulley's, who had a big network of plant, tree
garden
centres, all that sort of thing. And then cell phones became the rage, and I found that he and his mate owned a company called Ben Rumble, who sold the most cell phones in New Zealand. And as this sort of evolved, our relationship grew a little stronger as friends. And I used to, in order to address the big mortgage, always go when somebody called. So there was a dictum in medicine when I trained that groan you may, but go you must. So 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon is the least popular time for a doctor to get a call because everybody else is gone. And I got a call to go to a motel, which is just a motor hotel?
A cheap hotel.
Cheap hotel. Yeah. And I turned up, and it looked different from when I'd been there a couple of months before. There was some building had gone on, and I sort of thought, well, yes. Walked in, and there was John Ryder sitting in the office. "What are you doing here?" I said. And he said, "Oh, we think we might get into rest homes." And I said, "Really?" And what he had done was they'd connected all of these individual units with a corridor down the back, and they'd put in nurses. Now, prior to this, the average rest home in New Zealand was an old house converted where the bedrooms had curtains going 4 ways, and there was a bed in each corner of the bedroom. And John's friend, Kevin Hickman, who was a private investigator, had been called to a fire at a rest home, and just to assess whether it was a legitimate claim or not. And what he had seen really upset him, because there was an elderly lady on a chair being wheeled down to the bathroom down a corridor with her nightie askance and an absolute loss of dignity. And Kevin's response to that was, "That is not going to be good enough for my mum." So, not good enough for mum became a bit of a mantra, and so these two had bought this motorhome, cheap hotel, and converted it into a rest home. And the thing that fascinated me on looking at it was that, first of all, everyone had their own bathroom. So they had privacy, and their dignity was restored. The second thing that was evident was that there was a registered nurse there instead of somebody who had no training, and the registered nurse had pathways and procedures and protocols, and there was a formal training program for the carers. So the built form was significantly better, the care was better, and the privacy and dignity were being retained. So I found that very interesting. And so we chatted, and then he rang me a while later and said, we've got doing another one. And it was exactly the same thing, other side of the city. And
this being in Christchurch.
In Christchurch, yes, I'm sorry, yes. So I was interested, but no more than interested. And he asked me a few things about what I felt about care, what were the imperatives of care. And then he told me, we're going to buy a hospital. Why would you do that, John? And I think my vision of a hospital was the sort of public hospital where you have an operation and that sort of thing. No, he said, because people in the converted hotels needed care, and he couldn't put care into the facility that he had. So we're going to buy a hospital, so hospital-level care. And so therein was the birth of the concept of a continuum of care between somebody who had a level of independence through to somebody who needed care. And and then they asked me, would you like to be a director? And
so this was at the time there were now sort of two facilities, if you will.
Several facilities, and Ben the cell phone manufacturer, retailer, and all these other companies. And I was surprised about that, because I wasn't involved in corporate life, except that I had a track record of getting groups together. So Christchurch, the city of Christchurch, had about 140 general practitioners who all worked independently, and I convinced them all to work collectively and to take on the budget for the laboratory services and the budget for the pharmaceutical services, and that with education we would work as a cooperative. And we saved over 3 years about $40 million, which we then put back into free care for people who were terminally ill, and more immunisation. So I was quite comfortable in the communication. Getting doctors together is regarded as a bit like herding cats. So it's really difficult to get them to agree to things. So this, I think, attracted John and Kevin, and so, but we were constrained for capital.
Yeah. Let me just stop you there. So, so you had the two founders, which were Kevin Hickman and John Ryder.
Yes. The Rye and the Man.
So that's where the Rye and the Man comes.
Yes.
But it sounds like, from pretty much the very earliest days, you were sort of involved in the company.
Yeah. Well,
and when would this have been roughly?
This would have been early 90s. Early 90s. And they were known as the cop and the accountant. And there was a bit of a, in all countries there's sort of class systems and things, and they were a wee bit flashy, deemed a little bit flashy for some of the established people in the city. And so there was some negative commentary about them. But, they had enormous energy and determination, and they were entrepreneurial. So they wanted to grow the business more. Capital was constrained. And so in 1997, they said we should do an IPO, float on the NZX.
So how many villages would they have had at this time?
Would have been of the order of 6 or 8,
Yeah.
all in the South Island.
Right.
And so we sat through these sessions with potential investors, and the moment we used terms like deferred management fees and license to occupy, these are things that we can explain to you.
Maybe we should, before we get into that, which I definitely want to get to, because I know there's a lot of people here who probably don't even know what Ryman does. So
right, okay.
Now we know who you are and how the company got started. Let's maybe, what is Ryman? For the someone who hasn't heard of the company before.
Ryman buys bare land. It gets consent to build. It then manages the build of a village which will have independent living. It'll have service departments, which is assisted living, if you like. It'll have rest home, which is higher levels of assistance. It'll have hospital care, and it will have what we call special care units, which is a dementia facility. So we build that end-to-end
You have
operation.
These integrated villages, which is quite unusual in the industry.
That's right. So the continuum of care that I referred to a few moments ago is the point of difference. And in New Zealand, it was nobody else did it. Now there are other parties doing it. In Australia, in Victoria, where the company is very active at the moment, there is very little competition in terms of providing that continuum of care.
Which to me is like, I think. I remember when my own grandparents, needed to go into care, and you have a lot of companies which are focused on just one aspect of it. So when you're sort of reasonably healthy, they might offer you a service department. But then the question is, what happens when the health deteriorates, which is going to happen. And I think that's the wonderful thing about Ryman is when you're reasonably fit and healthy and want to live an independent lifestyle, you can go into an independent living unit, and no matter what happens, you're going to be taken care of.
Exactly. So we focus on like the average age of entry to an independent living unit is 79 years, and the average age of entry to a care end of the spectrum is about 85 years. So we focus not on a lifestyle decision so it's not somebody downsizing from their home because the children have left the nest. It's somebody who has needs in an unspecified manner, be they loneliness or be they health-related needs. And so our focus is much more at that end of the spectrum.
Yeah. So one point of differentiation is this continuum of care. But I know the the way the patients are treated, the culture of Ryman is also a very important part of the offering. So maybe you can describe that.
Yeah, culture is always quite difficult to describe, isn't it? But maybe if I sort of give you some thoughts about what has been the driving thinking. In terms of the residents, the whole plan is to retain their dignity and their privacy and to excite them, to exceed their expectations. And so that's a big part of our plan always.
So they stay engaged with life and
That's right.
live longer.
The evidence around loneliness is about the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So we provide a central facility where there's entertainment, there's happy hour drinks, there's pool tables, there's music, there's all sorts of stuff going on, so that many people, I was approached at an opening some years ago by this man who said, I want to speak. And I felt, I'm losing control here. But he stood up and he said, I feel like I've died and gone to heaven. This is marvellous. So I was able to breathe again. But the reality is that for many people, they will have been on their own for several years, and it will have been a struggle. So yes, we work really hard to delight them, and we like to give them, core determinations, we like to give them financial certainty. Because as you get old, financial certainty is really important. You can't cope with unexpected costs generally. And so that's a big part of the offering. And then if I could just track into the staff for a little bit, we had a strong commitment from the very beginning around staff being trained. And in fact, a whole training program for carers was developed, which Ryman developed, and then we gave to the sector in a trust so that all of the sector could utilise the training skills that we had developed because we felt that the whole sector could raise up standards. And so if you train people well, we pay them in the upper quartile always of any group, and put your faith in them, trust them and let them make decisions at the front line, because with healthcare you can't have all the decisions made behind. You've got to make the decision there and then when you're with the person.
Yeah. And how many villages do you have now in New Zealand? And maybe you can talk about Australia as well.
Yeah. So, look, it's about 40 in New Zealand, and there's forgive me if the numbers are not exactly right, 8 or 9 operational in Victoria, the state of Victoria, and about 15 sites under development across both.
So it's become a huge company from these modest beginnings.
Indeed, yeah. Yes.
It must have been exciting to be part of that journey.
It was very exciting, but there are some sentinel moments that I recall particularly, moments when we had pressure. So Christchurch, New Zealand had a very bad earthquake a decade ago where a number of the villages were damaged, and suddenly the builders from other cities who had built villages for us came flying down in their cars and trucks and white panel vans to help us rebuild. The staff's families came and helped us get things going again. And this was all a function of the philosophy that Kevin had, which was you must have long-term relationships, and relationships where all parties get what they want out of the deal. And so we have, still today, the kitchens are made in Christchurch and sent to Australia. Many of the suppliers of our soft furnishings are Christchurch-based, and they send them to Australia. So we try to build long-term relationships which are mutually beneficial. Then there's no argument about quality. There's no argument about time of delivery. So some of those things really played to our getting through things like the earthquake and like the GFC and those sorts of things that we've been challenged.
I think there's that sort of goodwill you've created with staff, suppliers, and it's not something you see in a balance sheet, but it's a value which is there. And
Absolutely. Yes. So there's sort of I suppose I was really pleased to see a week or so ago that an independent party assessed the company in terms of its ethical standards. And so this is the UK business ethics tool was applied to the company, and the company was one of a very small number on the NZX who got 10 out of 10. And I was really pleased to see that, because to me that makes you sleep straight in bed at night, doesn't it? You know, so the company's got high ethical standards, and I think things like the earthquakes and the coronavirus catastrophes that occurred and the GFC show that the company has still got agility despite being quite big. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. So many of the people here won't have seen one of your villages. I've been fortunate enough to visit many of them. They really look like a luxury country club, except there's a bowling green as opposed to a golf course in the middle. So you have, beautiful freestanding houses, or in some cases, large apartment blocks, a large village center, but these things are expensive. So explain maybe how the build of the villages is financed.
Okay, so the land is acquired, and then the build takes place, and the aim of the company is to achieve a development gain on the first sale. So the development gain usually given that we manage the build and manage the procurement, is usually of the order of 25%. So a sale is then made. It's not really a sale because the company remains the owner of the built form, but a license to occupy is sold. So there's 25% gain, and the average independent living unit at the moment is the license to occupy sells at around $1 million.
Yeah.
So when you buy that license to occupy, you enter into an arrangement. You have a 90-day cooling off period. You can pull out if suddenly you change your mind, but you enter into an arrangement around a deferred management fee, which is 20%, and it's 4% on entry to the village, and then 4% each year for the next 4 years. And that is what you won't get back. So after 5 years, you would get back $800,000. After 10 years, you'd get back $800,000. Is everyone understand? So there's a fixed deferred management fee, which we accrue as a gain on an annual basis.
And it's a win-win for everybody because you receive the occupancy advance, so you effectively get the cash out of the village, so you can build new ones. And from the perspective of the resident, they have the financial security.
That's right. And so we do all the maintenance. There's no sales commission or anything, and the property at 10 years or whenever the person moves out is refurbished completely at the company's cost, and then it is sold again. So the benefit of house price inflation, which we might talk about a little bit in a moment, but it's sort of a long run would be 4 to 5% per annum. So instead of selling it for $1 million after 5 years, you might sell it for 1.15 or $1.2 million, on which you then charge a deferred management fee of 20%. Yeah. And so you can see there's a sort of a bit of a wave built in.
A flywheel, yeah.
Yeah. In addition to that, you pay a weekly fee. And that weekly fee is of the order of about $200 per week. And that covers window cleaning, it covers your rates, it covers
gardening,
all the other sort of stuff. But that is fixed. That never goes up. If you're there 20 years, you'll still only pay whatever you paid on entry to the village. So this is to do with the certainty, financial certainty that people like when they're in that age group.
Yeah.
Is that a fair explanation?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I know purpose is a very important part of why you work, so maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, the purpose is what really unifies and motivates people, isn't it? And so we generally have been blessed with staff who are enormously motivated towards. We've all got grandparents, and so we all can identify with looking after our grandparents and then our parents, and then at my age you start thinking about yourself. So good enough for mum, and then there's a few dots, and maybe dad if dad survives, because men obviously don't live quite as long. Is sort of the mantra that we preach, and we encourage all our staff to think about, well, was that interaction with the person on the telephone good enough for an interaction with your mother, really? And so that is the strong driver. Basically, we are committed to looking after older people in their final years and retaining their dignity and enjoyment in life.
Great. So if we fast forward to the present, Ryman was a company that suffered somewhat from COVID. COVID is fortunately behind us now, but if I look at the last 12 months, the stock price has gone down, and I think the company's had one or two problems. So what is your view on why the market has taken a more negative view on the company?
Okay, well, you're absolutely right. Ryman coped with COVID extremely well, and we had everybody turned up to help sort that out. And in essence, we decided we were just going to listen to experts, not to the government, and we just did exactly what our experts told us to do. And that involved some quite a significant expenditure, which the board said, no, you do what you need to do to look after our residents. That's the most important thing. And so there was no how much was that going to cost discussion, which I was really proud of everybody for thinking like that. So we invested heavily. Things like staff were paid additional payments for being on shifts, and residents were given meals and parties in a box and all manner of things, basically to make them manage through the lockdowns, because the lockdowns was what was the biggest challenge. So Victoria, which is the Australian state in which we operate, was locked down for 6 months. And that caused a significant challenge for our construction team, because the rules in Victoria were that you could only have 25% of your construction workforce on the ground at any time. Well, that's very challenging. Is it 25% of your painters and 25% of your concrete layers? It was a massively challenging thing. So that was 6 months of lockdown. And in Auckland, New Zealand, which was locked down for 3 months, similar sort of challenges. And Auckland and Victoria amount to about 50% of the company's portfolio going forward. So it was a big challenge for us to manage the lockdown, and add to that the complexity of older people feeling that safest place was at home with the door shut, rather than coming and visiting a village and finding out whether they want to move into a unit. So there was a dramatic reduction in our ability to transact and as well. So that was a hiccup we never foresaw. But
you did the right thing, right?
We did the right thing. We did the right thing, and with associated financial challenge. But at the same time, we are building at 15 different sites at the moment. And if you just take a rough figure of $100 million at each site invested, there's $1.5 billion of debt effectively accounted for. And some of the sites, the most wonderful sites, such as the ones that you may have seen, Rob, but they are complex in that they're multi-storey towers, and you cannot sell anything until you finish the very last unit at the very top of each tower. And so they're multi-storey towers, complex, and they have been designed, I'd suggest, as much as 5 or 6 years ago. And 5 or 6 years ago, the provision of care to people who actually needed intense care, like hospital-level care or dementia care, was profitable. So the company made a quarter of its profit from sales of occupational rights, a quarter from the development gain from between build and sale price, a quarter from care, and a quarter from the weekly fees. And so there were all these legs of income. But over the last 5 years, the New Zealand government, less so the Australian government, have felt these care companies are making lots of money. We don't need to put the fees up. And so care has become an unprofitable, significantly unprofitable activity, which is a big challenge for us in terms of our purpose and our commitment to care, because you can't just move somebody out and say, well, you're on your own now. So a number of changes have been undertaken to try and address that in the last... would you like me to describe that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Go on.
So effectively, we've reduced the number of care beds. So we worked out how many care beds do we need for this village with so many independent living units. How many care beds do we need? And let's not build more than that, because we used to build a full care facility. Only build what we need for our village. Second opportunity is that we're actually looking to charge a deferred management fee on the room, because the room it's a room with an ensuite. It's really just like a mini apartment. So we're looking to make some changes like that to try to recover the return on capital from building a full care facility. So those sorts of things take time to flow through.
Yeah. It sounds like a transitory problem that you have a solution for, though.
We do, but one has to be very mindful that some of our residents are there, and we gave them certainty on day one. We can't, on year 4, suddenly say, oh, now we're going to change your arrangement, you know. And some of them are delighted to live beyond the changes, and some of them have been there 10 and 15 years, and this is marvellous, you know. So, but we obviously can't change the rules for them until they move on. Yeah.
What about the property market? Obviously, it's been very hot for a very long time in New Zealand and Australia. The market seems to be turning down now. What is the impact of that?
Yeah, so the property market in New Zealand has been hot for a long time, partly because limited land, partly because population growth, partly because of low interest rates. But the biggest factor in New Zealand has been the taxation arrangements. So there is no capital gains tax. So if you buy a house as an investment for $1 million and you sell it 2 years later for $1.5 million, you've got $500,000 no tax. So that has driven very significant house price inflation. So the house price inflation for the 18 months to November 21 was 40.5%. And in Australia, less so, it was around 20%. But that is very significant inflation in an 18-month period. Since then, there's been enormous discussion about house price inflation dropping away and house prices dropping. And this plays, of course, to one of the reasons for the current share price. Because you make the money through the development gain and on the resale of the that's right, exactly. So house price inflation has come back. In New Zealand, it's come back about 12 to 17%. But it was 40 to start with, you know. So it was an absolutely unreal number. In Australia, 20% up and around 7% back. And it seems to be flattening in that the clearance from auctions clearance of sales is occurring steadily now, and prices are seem fine. The biggest change has been for entry-level homes, rather than the sort of homes that we find our residents have. So when we go to an area, we look at the value of the residential homes in the area. We look at the percentage of people who have mortgages, and something like 85% of the people in the geographical areas we go to have no mortgage, and we price the unit. So what the example I gave was $1 million. We price it so that, in fact, it's only ever 80% of the value of their home. So that gives
the
us...
idea being from the sale proceeds of their own home, they
come out with some cash and they feel good. Now, the interesting thing is that currently there's a lot of negative sentiment about house price inflation. There's a lot of commentary about interest rates. And then when analysts look at the debt level of the company at about $3 billion on equity of around 12, I think, they say, woe is me, this is a massive problem. It's not it is a problem, don't get me wrong, but it is not a problem which cannot be addressed. It's a problem partly of perception and sentiment, because $3 billion is a very large number for a New Zealand company. But not for other companies, but for a New Zealand company, it's a very large number. But when you consider that interest rates have around, I think the official cash rate in New Zealand is around 5% at the moment, and it looks like it'll flatten off. At the most, it'll go to 5.25 or 5.5. And interest rates in Australia are already regarded as peaking now. So interest rates are going to come back. It's not impossible, given that 50% of the debt is fixed for the next couple of years anyway, in terms of interest rates. But there is a negative sentiment towards the sector, which is really hard for me to understand. And I think it's partly because of the profitability on the property side that the sector has.
So much for the present. Looking to the future, 40 villages in New Zealand, I think 5 open ones in Australia, many more in the land bank. If we look sort of 5, 10 or more years into the future, where do you see Ryman in the long term?
Right. Well, some work done a couple of years ago led me to think that we could have easily 25 to 30 villages in Victoria. And Victoria, as I mentioned earlier, the competition is not mature at all, so we could have as many villages as that. One of the challenges that the company has is that from the moment of deciding to go to a geographical area until we actually are able to sell something, it's sometimes 5 years, and then to complete the village, 7 to 8 years. So it's quite a long gestation period. So to go beyond Victoria, the logical state to go to next would be New South Wales, which is immediately adjacent. My belief is that needs to be started to be thought about now. Yeah. Quite a lot of effort has gone into building a management team in Australia, and one of the mistakes we made early on was we managed Australia from New Zealand, and this is not a way to build strength and unity of purpose, and But we now have a very efficient management team, and they contributed about 50% of the underlying profit for the first half.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So I would see another state as being the next logical step.
And beyond Australia?
I don't really know. I was approached a few years ago maybe 18 months ago, by a Spanish company who had real estate, who said that if Ryman would tell them the model, they would provide the land, and we'd do a 50-50 partnership. And I quite like Spain, but we decided that there's a great danger in spreading yourself too thinly, and I think we've already probably done that as a company, spread ourselves a bit thinly, and we just need to steady things up a bit.
Absolutely. And for you personally, I know being chairman of Ryman was probably almost a full-time job, and you're a practicing GP at the same time. Now that at least the Ryman part has fallen away, what are your plans?
I think I better check in and find out from Debbie what my plans are. Being with Ryman was a most exciting and wonderful experience. Going to a village and being accosted by an older person and said, "Now listen, you're the chairman, aren't you? Now, I didn't like that dessert I had last night, or can't you do something about the quality of the wine?" Or so having those wonderful interactions with older people, and being a GP, you learn to read the death notices in New Zealand, like I do, just find out who I did do well with and who I didn't, and so often the death notices will give really positive comments to our villages and our village managers. I don't know whether they do that in Europe, but in New Zealand they actually say these things. And so, it's a very rewarding experience. So I didn't mind the time. I loved it, yeah.
But your own plans, how are you going to fill up your time?
Well, I'm still a director of a couple of operations and private hospital, and there's a charity, the City Mission, that I'm a trustee for, which looks after people who have fallen on hard times and that sort of thing. So,
Okay, sounds like you're going to be busy. I think we've got about 10 minutes left. Should we take a few questions from the audience?
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't see my mic assistants here, so I probably carry the mic around. I can see Caroline at the back. Oh, there they are. I'm sorry. I didn't see you come.
Hello. You're still very busy, I gather, but will the village be good enough for you?
Yes, every village is improved in ways, and that's a sort of another mantra we've always had. What didn't we do quite well enough? So the good example is that we built exercise rooms in some of the villages about 8 years ago, and now the exercise rooms have to be twice as big because so many people do yoga, they do tai chi, do exercise. So will the village be good enough for me? Yes, it will, absolutely. That's not been a personal motivation, but of course it's the way in which you think, isn't it? How would I feel? Correct.
Hi. I would like to ask if you are not planning to buying back your shares and current lowest price to book ratios. Given that I'm not on the board, it's not really possible for me to comment on what the board might or might not be doing. I think that many parties are sitting on the sidelines thinking that there will be a capital raise, and that's depressed the share price. It would be nice if the company found itself in a position to say that is not going to happen or it is going to happen, so that some clarity could exist, but it's not something that I have any knowledge of. Look, I'm a net buyer of shares in the last month or so, that's all I can really say. I am as surprised and distressed as any other shareholder would be. Thank you.
Question there.
Hi, and thank you for being here. I understood, and maybe wrongly, that you buy land without planning permissions, and then you get these planning permissions. How can you make sure that you will?
I just couldn't hear.
I can hear it either. Yeah.
Sorry? Oh, the question is, I understood that you buy land without planning permissions, and then you get these planning permissions and you build. How can you make sure that you will get planning permissions?
So the question is buying land without planning permission.
Yeah. So before we buy the land, we obviously relate to the local territorial authority and debate with them what is the chances and that sort of thing. So there's a spectacular piece of land on the Mornington Peninsula in Victoria called Mount Eliza, where we met with the council and said we would like to buy this land and build a village, and they were very supportive, and so we bought the land, and within a month or so there's an election and the council changed completely. And that has given us about 6 years of grief, and we've just, before Christmas, we got consent finally, but having to go through a legal process. So we usually can get consent, it's just how quickly, but it is always done after a lot of debate and discussion before we acquire the land. And often the trick is to actually get the consent and then to start the building and then to go back and try and enlarge the consent or add to it. So that's something that we've learnt over the years. But no, it's not done without great care.
And I think it's fair to say you get a better price from the seller if it's not contingent on having consent. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, so traditionally we would buy from a seller who didn't maybe appreciate the value proposition, but as the company's got bigger and its name has been bandied about more and more, we have people coming to us. And it's going to be interesting over the next year to 18 months because as construction activity is starting to decrease and construction cost inflation is starting to decrease, that's traditionally a time when the land will start to become available at more advantageous prices. So it'll be a big discussion for the board, I would imagine, about how much capital are we going to put into land versus steadying up the balance sheet. So, yeah.
Great. Oh, there's one question from the internet?
Yeah, just one question from the live stream. Could you talk a little bit about how you've built a competitive advantage on the development side relative to a pretty crowded field with private equity developers, other competitors, and how that advantage might change in an environment like this where capital has become scarce and the demand picture has changed?
Can you just...
So in the competition to buy land, why you're potentially a better buyer of land than, say, private equity or all the other types of developers?
I don't know that I can easily answer that question, I'm sorry. I think that we have often in the early days, we would buy bits of land that didn't have appeal to other operators. It would be beside a cliff, or it would be near a railway station, or there'd be something that made it less desirable, and we would then work to build something that's desirable out of that. Some of the big Auckland sites that I mentioned a moment ago, which are complex and wonderful, they're going to be wonderful generators of income over the medium to long term. They were sites which really were unaffordable to anyone other than a company like Ryman who could generate a capital gain from it. The basic philosophy in the early days was that we needed to build a village and get out without leaving any capital in there. That was the fundamental philosophy. And so then you go on to the next one. That hasn't been possible in the last 5 to 7 years because Kerr has been so poorly funded. So the capital cost of building the Kerr facility killed that. We're able to do that in terms of the independent living units. We recycle capital completely, but we leave money on the table around the Kerr. And that's why the option to use a deferred management fee for the Kerr beds or a refundable accommodation deposit is another term that's used for the Kerr beds is being looked at much more closely.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. The way I understood you earlier was that you finish the complete town before you start selling units. Wouldn't it be possible to either sell off-plan or make model units and sell them before they're actually finished to reduce the amount of debt you need to take on?
Yes, I probably didn't explain myself well. We do pre-sell. We pre-sell from the time we have the plans, and that gives us some certainty. In fact, we pre-sell before we even have the plans sometimes. And that gives us some certainty as to how the village is going to go. The dilemma is that when construction cost inflation is the way it is, you pre-sell at a price, and then you actually, to complete the village, it's at a different price, you know? So how much you pre-sell is a very important decision for the company, particularly when construction cost inflation is high. So yeah, I may have misled you in the way I described it before.
Yeah, and I think typically the incoming resident is selling their own property to move in, so they can only pay once they can physically move in, right?
Exactly. So those of you who've looked at the sort of result from the first half, there was $500 of contracted sales not settled. And so these are people who've contracted to come into the village, but they haven't paid because they haven't sold their home, because days to sell have gone out, because house price negative sentiment exists, you know. So there's quite a lot of money that is contracted but hasn't actually been delivered.
Got it. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. There's one there from Alex.
Could you talk about the competitive intensity? There's no really obvious barrier to entry besides a lot of capital. I know a lot of people out there have tried to replicate what Ryman did, some less successfully than others. Can you talk about what that history has been like and maybe what the state of play is today?
Yeah, so in the early days there was no competition, and that was delightful, most enjoyable really. But then a number of other operators started up. And so Ryman roughly has, say, 12,000 beds, and 50% of those have a care component. Somerset, which is the fast follower, I don't think it's an offensive way to describe them, but they have 6,000 beds but they have 17% of care beds. And I struggle to see how they can give the promise that we give our potential residents that this is your address, this will always be your address. You do not need to worry, you will receive whatever care you need. So I struggle to see how other operators can give that promise. And that was a sort of an early commitment that we entered into that I would be really reluctant to forego. I'm happy to forego dividends and things like that, but I think that the commitment to residents is such a powerful tool. And you know, I sometimes have looked at the marketing budget and I wonder really whether the best marketers are actually the residents. You know, so often their neighbours are next door in an independent living unit. So I think that they're extremely powerful marketers. So the journey with competitors was no competitors to start with. There are no competitors effectively in Australia currently, but there are Somerset, Oceania, a number of Arvida, a number of good operators, but they're unable to make the promise we make.
So how powerful is the Ryman brand in New Zealand? I'm sure most people here won't be familiar with it.
So it's been the most trusted brand for about the last 8 or 10 years on surveys, and that's really a wonderful tribute to the staff and to the way in which the company's operated. And I think that gives a level of resilience. So the sort of, in terms of resilience of the company, being the most trusted brand, being a highly ethical company, addressing the financial challenges in ways that have already been described to some of you, and I can talk about it some more. And the fact that we create this gap between what we sell the occupational rights for and what the resident gets for their home, and noting also that we are going to, over the next 10 years, see this massive transfer of wealth from the generation who are going to be residents, that they have more than their home. They have a holiday house. They have equities. So the scope exists quite clearly for us to not have to retreat. So we haven't had to reduce prices at all.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. And a good note to end on. Yeah. David, thank you so much for making the journey here with your wife, Debbie. I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend. You've kindly offered to hang around and meet with the investors here. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for the invitation, Rob.